World War II in the Pacific. A U.S. submarine commander checks his bearings before firing torpedoes into the hull of a Japanese merchant ship. On the other side of the world, a German U-boat commander sweeps the horizon for submarine hunters before attacking an Allied convoy bringing desperately needed supplies from America to beleaguered Britain. Blockade is one of the most potent weapons of war. Sink a warship, and a nation's military capacity is barely scratched. Cut its supply lines, however, and you've threatened its ability to wage war, even to survive. The battle plan is blockade. Europe, 1940. Hitler's armies occupy much of the continent. He now controls the French Atlantic coastline. Only one country is left, Britain. Although isolated, she remains a major threat to Hitler's military ambitions. But Britain is highly vulnerable. As a maritime nation, she relies on the high seas to bring in food and supplies. To continue fighting, she needs even more weapons, munitions, and the men to help her fight. One ally is vital, the United States, with its vast resources of food, industrial power, and ultimately, its men. So how can Germany shut off this supply? How can the German naval battle planners bring Britain to its knees? December 1941. The United States prepares to fight back after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. It won't be easy. The Japanese homeland is more than 5,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean. Japan has a strong navy and a defensive cordon of well-fortified islands. But Japan, like Britain, is an island nation. To support its population and feed its hungry war machine, Japan is dependent on raw materials, especially oil, transported by sea from other parts of Southeast Asia. For the Germans fighting against Britain and the Americans fighting against Japan, the battle plan is the same: blockade. Blockade is an all-or-nothing battle plan. This strategy imposes very special requirements, not just on military commanders, but a nation's political leadership. Political will. Blockade is an act of war, not only against an enemy, but often against powerful neutral nations that supply that enemy. Attacking neutral assets can result in bringing other nations into the war on the side of the enemy.
Blockades often have unintended consequences. The British blockade of Europe intended to put strain upon Napoleon ends up irritating neutrals. In particular, it leads to the War of 1812 between Britain and the United States. Similarly, the Union blockade of the Confederate States causes great strain between the United States and such European powers as France and Britain.
Because of the potential consequences involved in blockade, battle planners must be sure that their strategic aims outweigh this very considerable risk. Method. Planners must have the right weapons and methods to cut off their enemy's supply routes. Technology. Because a blockade can last for months or years, scientists and engineers on both sides must develop new methods to locate and destroy the enemy, and countermeasures to the enemy's new weapons. More than any other battle plan, Blockade is a race of upgrading technology. Intelligence. A blockading force must have accurate intelligence to locate enemy shipping in the vast oceans. To defeat a blockade, intelligence is needed to find where enemy forces lie in wait, so that convoys can avoid them and warships be sent to destroy them. Tactics. Commanders must constantly adapt their tactics to the new weapons and countermeasures being introduced by the enemy. Blockades have been used for centuries, but as a war-winning battle plan, this strategy really only became feasible after the Industrial Revolution.
History is full of examples of attempts to impose a blockade upon an enemy, but these blockades only become effective once navies become large enough and modern enough to properly enforce them. And this really means that blockades only start to work at the beginning of the 19th century.
By the beginning of the 20th century, the world had become a global marketplace. Nations relied heavily on imported food and vital raw materials. Stopping those imports would cause a nation to starve, and a starving nation can't win a war. Blockade was now a potentially lethal battle plan. World War I provided an example of just how deadly the stranglehold of a blockade could be. The British blockade of Germany during that war caused widespread hardship to civilians. This suffering played a major part in demoralizing Germany's army and led to its eventual collapse. 2 decades later, at the beginning of World War II, the stakes were even higher. Battle planners on all sides were very aware that a well-executed blockade could win or lose the entire war. For the Germans facing war in the North Atlantic, and for the Americans preparing to fight in the Pacific, commanders must make their first critical decision in the battle plan for blockade. Political will. Both the US and German political leaders must decide if the strategic benefits of blockade outweigh its political risks, especially that of bringing a powerful neutral nation into the war. Both Germany and Britain had learned firsthand about the political risks of blockade during World War I, when German U-boats engaged in unrestricted warfare against all ships approaching the British Isles. The problem was that some of those ships carried passengers of neutral countries. On May 7, 1915, the German U-boat U-20 sank the Cunard liner Lusitania. Nearly 1,200 lives were lost, 124 of them citizens of the neutral United States of America. When news reached the US, the public was outraged. The incident played a major part in bringing the US into World War I on the Allied side. So, 24 years later, at the beginning of World War II in the Atlantic, the leadership of all sides are acutely aware of the lessons of the Lusitania incident. For the Germans, they must once again face the test of whether they have the political will to implement a truly effective blockade. September 3rd, 1939, just hours after the formal declaration of war, U-boat U-30 lies in wait as the British liner Athenia, with 1,400 passengers, steams into her crosshairs. The North Atlantic, September 3rd, 1939. Britain and Germany have been at war for only a few hours. U-30 floods her torpedo tubes, arms the weapons, and fires. The British liner Athenia is dealt a death blow. Of the 1,400 passengers on board, 112 perish. 28 of the dead are American. It seems that a campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare sinking without warning is underway. The United States is predictably enraged at Germany. Hitler is so fearful that this sort of incident might provoke neutral America into entering the war against him that he forbids the U-boats to attack any more ocean liners. But less than a year later, in August 1940, as the Battle of Britain is reaching its peak, Hitler decides to risk a total blockade of the British Isles. All shipping approaching British ports is to be sunk on sight. Yet even now, he is still fearful of America. Only after Pearl Harbor in December 1941 do his U-boats begin operating in the Western Atlantic. So it's not until 2 years after World War II began that the German blockade of Britain becomes a no-holds-barred campaign. The strategic and political implications of the battle plan had held Hitler back until then. December 7th, 1941. The United States Pacific Fleet burns at Pearl Harbor. In response, President Franklin Roosevelt has no inhibitions about ordering U.S. submarines to attack Japanese shipping.
From America they will get.
Roosevelt's order is stark: unrestricted submarine warfare against any ships on their way to Japan. For the United States, the political implications are small. But U.S. naval commanders are slow to translate the strategic decision into a battle plan to blockade Japan. Neither they nor the Japanese have foreseen that this is the way a naval war in the Pacific would be fought.
Prior to World War II, neither the Japanese Navy nor the U.S. Navy had paid much attention to the question of blockading the Japanese home islands. Instead, both navies maintained a traditional focus on the Great Fleet engagement, the battle of battleship against battleship.
So in both the Atlantic and the Pacific, it takes time for the German and U.S. submarines to be fully unleashed. And it's only when their political masters have taken the decision to use blockade that the German and U.S. commanders face the second requirement of the battle plan: method. Planners must have the right weapons and approach to cut their enemy's supply routes. In the years leading up to World War II, Hitler began to rearm Germany, and war with Britain was certainly on his mind. His planners determined they would need a substantial battle fleet to successfully defeat the British Navy. Powerful surface warships to both pin down Britain's surface fleet and launch attacks on its convoys. As a result, U-boats had been given a relatively low priority. In the build-up to war, Admiral Dönitz, head of the U-boat arm of the German Navy, had estimated that at least 300 submarines would be needed to wage an effective blockade of Britain. But at the outbreak of war, he has only 55, and only 12 of those are capable of operating out into the Atlantic.
The Germans prior to the Second World War interestingly made many similar mistakes to that made prior to the First World War. They actually designed a fleet for rapid success, for maritime supremacy, for a decisive battle and for an invasion. They weren't interested in attrition, and they weren't interested therefore in blockade.
During the first months of the war, attempts by German surface ships to raid British convoys proved largely ineffective. The powerful British Navy either destroys them at sea or bottles them up in port. Dönitz's submarines, meanwhile, are tasting success. U-boats are sinking more than one merchant ship a day. After German forces defeat France, Admiral Dönitz establishes submarine bases in ports on the Bay of Biscay, with a command center at Lorient. The U-boats are able to get out into the Atlantic virtually unhindered. Their commanders call the period from July to October 1940 the happy time. 217 merchant ships are sunk. But Hitler still insists on the power of his surface battle fleet until May 1941. On her maiden voyage, the pride of Hitler's fleet, the battleship Bismarck, is hunted down by the British Navy and sunk off the coast of France. It's a devastating blow. Hitler insists thereafter that none of his surface ships are to be risked chasing elusive convoys. Only now, 20 months after the war has begun, is the U-boat finally recognized as the only weapon which really could blockade Britain effectively. Dönitz is finally able to unleash his U-boat wolf packs en masse. His adversary is Admiral Max Horton, commander of Britain's submarine force, who becomes Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches in November 1942. His mission is to defeat the German U-boat menace and get the convoys through. Who will win, Horton or Dönitz, now depends not just on the courage and skill of the commanders and their crews, but their skill in adapting to bewildering changes. In the Pacific War, the decision of the United States to use its submarines to mount a no-holds-barred blockade is just as hesitant as that of the Germans in the Atlantic. Pre-war training for U.S. submarine commanders had been geared to supporting the surface fleet. Now they must learn new operating techniques, new tactics. In terms of the battle plan for blockade, it takes time not only to realize that it's a feasible strategy, but also to understand the correct method of imposing it. In the Pacific, the Japanese shipping routes carrying vital raw materials to Japan and vital supplies to the Japanese garrisons overseas are thousands of miles from the U.S. submarine bases. Both the German and American submariners must now overcome the problem of the size of their battlefield and get to grips with their enemy. December 1941. It's only now that America has entered the war that Dönitz can send his hunters west. At first, along the eastern seaboard of the United States. Then, off the coast of Florida. Then, into the Gulf of Mexico. Gradually, the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard get the upper hand. After losing a number of U-boats to American countermeasures, the Germans pull back again deeper into the Atlantic. In the Pacific, the U.S. submarine campaign against Japan would take another 2 years to get into full stride. But as the war progresses, U.S. commanders begin to realize that the blockade battle plan could be a war winner. Technology. In the battle plan for blockade, victory goes to the side which can develop and then use technology the most effectively. This will be clearly shown in the battles of both the Atlantic and the Pacific. But in the Atlantic, the margin of superiority will be closer, and the result will hang in the balance.
The German attempt to blockade the British Isles was really an attempt to stop the Americans from supplying the British and the Allies with the resources that they need to take the battle to Germany. It resulted in a massive race of technology. The German U-boat technology pushing those boundaries forward, and of course the Allies trying to counter the German U-boat technology, hunting them down and destroying them.
The importance of technology had been clearly shown in the Atlantic during World War I, as Germany and Britain sought to blockade each other into defeat. On the offensive, Germany designed and developed new style submarines and torpedoes. On the defensive, the British developed methods of detecting enemy submarines, especially ASDIC, named after the Anti-Submarine Detection Committee, a sonar device which detected a submerged submarine's direction and distance by bouncing sound waves off its hull. Then, the British focused on methods of destroying the German U-boats. The most effective of these was the depth charge, an oil drum-sized canister packed with high explosives and triggered by a device that reacted to the change in pressure as the depth charge sank. But it was also the British who were to prove most successful at imposing their own blockade on Germany. Their old-fashioned technology of surface vessels, destroyers and smaller craft, stopping and searching merchant ships in the North Sea approaches to German harbors, effectively tightened a noose around Germany, which began to have a disastrous effect on its ability to continue the war. In World War II, the technological challenge for the attackers is to build submarines which go faster with a longer range, which can stay submerged for longer periods, and carry as many torpedoes as possible. And because early submarine attacks will actually take place on the surface, deck armaments. In the Atlantic, the mainstay of the German U-boat fleet are the 800-ton Type 7 and the slightly larger 1,100-ton Type 9 submarines. A typical U-boat has a surface speed of 17 knots, a submerged speed of 8 knots, and can stay submerged for 18 hours while cruising at 4 knots. It has 4 21-inch torpedo tubes forward and 1 aft, and can carry about 14 torpedoes. On deck are an 88 or 105 millimeter gun and 1 or 2 twin anti-aircraft guns. In the Pacific, the mainstays of the American fleet are the 1,500 to 1,800-ton Gato and Balao class submarines. With 10 torpedo tubes, 6 forward and 4 aft, a 3-inch gun, and 2 anti-aircraft guns, the Gato and Balao boats have a surface speed of 20 knots and almost 9 knots submerged. Less maneuverable than the German U-boats, but much larger, they're able to make far longer patrols carrying a heavier armament. But especially in the German battle plan to blockade Britain, it's the technology of anti-submarine warfare which dictates the way the battle is fought and whether it's won or lost. For the first 2 years of the Battle of the Atlantic, the Allies have ASDIC, later known as sonar, which detects submarines below the surface. But there is no way of detecting them when they are actually on the surface. During this period, U-boats attack on the surface, appearing in the middle of convoys at night to wreak their havoc. The U-boats are winning. But during 1941, the British fit radar on escort vessels so that the U-boats can be detected on the surface. Radar is also developed, which can be carried by aircraft. To avoid detection by radar, U-boat commanders now have to attack while submerged, which exposes them to a whole array of anti-submarine warfare technology. Improved depth charges. Hedgehog, which launches a 24-bomb barrage ahead of the escort vessel, thus reducing a submarine's chances of taking evasive action. HFDF, High Frequency Direction Finding, nicknamed HFDF, also enable ships to pinpoint the U-boats by intercepting their radio signals. For both sides in the Atlantic blockade war, aircraft technology is also crucial. The Germans used the long-range Focke-Wulf Condor to pinpoint convoys for the U-boats, as well as sinking ships themselves. In the first deadly years of the blockade war, however, the Allies have a problem. The Atlantic War. A Catalina scours the gray seas for U-boats. But until the middle of 1943, Admiral Max Horton's aircraft, operating out of Britain, Newfoundland, Iceland, and Gibraltar, have a limited range. Because of this, there is a black gap in the Atlantic which cannot be covered from the air. It's the favorite hunting ground for Dönitz's U-boats. As the range of aircraft increases, the gap becomes smaller. But sailors still call it Torpedo Alley. So in this one crucial area of the War of the Atlantic, technology has so far failed to combat the U-boats. In the Pacific, scientists are also developing the technology to assist submarine commanders. The first radar is fitted to a U.S. submarine in 1942. Improved torpedoes are introduced. Yet in the Pacific, there is essentially no technological race in the battle plan for blockade. Unlike the British in the Atlantic blockade war, the Japanese do not develop anti-submarine warfare.
One of the remarkable things about the Pacific War during this period is the Japanese make no attempt to try and break the American blockade, in spite of the fact that they are so dependent upon resources coming across the sea lanes to Japan. They do nothing about it. It's a remarkable state of affairs.
But technology doesn't simply solve the problem of how to attack or how to defend. It plays a crucial part in the next important requirement for the blockade battle plan: intelligence. To use his technological advantages to their best effect, a commander must be able to track down his enemy, and the enemy must try to locate the attacker's submarines and avoid them. For Dönitz, part of this is supplied by German spies in New York and other ports along the eastern seaboard, reporting back convoy departures. But a key part of the intelligence war is dictated by technology. In 1939, the British, at their Bletchley Park Cryptographic Center, began to break into the German Enigma code. In early spring 1941, they complete this when a top-secret Enigma cipher machine and code settings are retrieved from a sinking U-boat. Code breakers are now able to read U-boat signals, and the Allies can reroute convoys. By summer 1941, shipping losses are down to a third of the spring figures. For a moment, there is hope for the convoys. Early in 1942, however, the U-boat switched to a new version of the Enigma cipher, called Triton, which defeats British codebreakers until the end of the year. The convoys are again at risk. Code-breaking also plays a vital role in the Pacific. Starting just before Pearl Harbor, American cryptanalysis units cracked the Japanese JN-25 naval codes. Intelligence from this is vital for U.S. submarine commanders. The U.S. also benefits hugely from the Japanese refusal to believe that their codes could be broken. Throughout the war, every Japanese merchant ship has to send a daily report of its position. The Americans and British gratefully read these messages and destroy the ships. Technology also plays a vital part in the last requirement in the battle plan for blockade. Tactics. How and where to best deploy against the target. And in the knowledge that the enemy is also devising its own tactics. In the blockade war of the Atlantic, Dönitz and the Germans developed their tactics from their World War I experience, and their U-boats hunt in packs. When one U-boat spots a convoy, it signals for the others and the pack closes in. To counter this, the Allies struggled to produce and train enough escorts to give the convoys adequate protection. In the Pacific, the development in tactics is one-sided. The Japanese do not change their patterns and do not develop their tactics. The Americans, led by Admiral Charles Lockwood, the Pacific Submarine Force commander, do. Until 1943, U.S. submarines are used individually for hit-and-run missions and in support of surface ships. They also stay on the perimeter of Japanese shipping lanes. During 1943, all that changes. From now on, U.S. commanders begin to hunt in organized groups. They begin systematic patrols of key Japanese sea traffic patterns, rather than staying on the perimeter. In July 1943, they begin to penetrate the key straits into the Sea of Japan. The American task is made easier because the Japanese do not group their merchant ships together and protect them in convoys.
The Japanese lack of interest in protecting convoys was, I think, part and parcel of their general neglect of logistics. That the Japanese sailor wanted to be a samurai at sea. He wanted to fight enemy forces. He didn't want to spend his time protecting merchant vessels.
U.S. reevaluation of patrol zones means an increased number of contacts. And a new directive from Admiral Lockwood to the U.S. submarine fleet orders the specific targeting of Japanese oil tankers in an attempt to cut off Japanese fuel supplies throughout the Pacific. They concentrate on what becomes known as the Luzon bottleneck, the strait between which oil from Sumatra and Java must be ferried. In August 1943, Japan imports 1.75 million barrels of oil per month. A year later, the figure is just 360,000 barrels per month. The Japanese Navy alone needs 1.6 million barrels a month. The U.S. blockade in the Pacific is working. In 1944, U.S. submarines are sinking enemy vessels at a rate of 50 per month. This is helped by the American push across the Pacific.
One of the very great difficulties for the United States during the war in the Pacific were the great distances from US naval bases in the United States through to the Japanese islands.
Before the war, U.S. submarines are based at Pearl Harbor and Cavite in Manila Harbor. After Pearl Harbor, they also operate out of Australia from Fremantle and Brisbane. After the Marshall Islands are taken in February 1944, U.S. submarines begin operating from a base at Majuro Atoll. After the Marianas are taken in June 1944, from a base at Apra Harbor at Guam. And when the Carolines are attacked, from a base at Ulithi Atoll.
Later in the war, when the Americans begin to take many of the Pacific islands, of course, there isn't so much of a difficulty in having to resupply the ships over a protracted period. The Americans can resupply their submarines at a far shorter distance, far nearer to Japan.
There is, however, a fundamental difference in the blockade wars in the Atlantic and the Pacific. In the Pacific, the battle plan for blockade is one of steady attrition. Eventually, U.S. submarines are obliged to search out coastal shipping as Japan's merchant fleet is ruthlessly destroyed. In the Atlantic, on the other hand, the battle swings back and forth, and the costs are mounting for both Horten and Dönitz. By the early spring of 1943, Germany is winning. Wolfpacks prowl Torpedo Alley. In March of 1943 alone, they sink 120 Allied ships, 4 merchantmen a day. But the battle plan for blockade in the Atlantic is about to climax in a cataclysmic month-long battle which would effectively decide it.
This was the moment when the Germans were most successful in their attempts to close down the shipping lanes from the United States to Britain. It was during this period that the Americans and the British lost more vessels to submarine warfare than at any other time. Had the Battle of the Atlantic been lost at this stage, the war could have ended very differently.
Mid-March, and ill luck puts 2 eastbound convoys laden with urgently needed supplies in Torpedo Alley at the same time. 3 Wolfpacks of 18, 11, and 8 U-boats are waiting for them. The convoys are slaughtered. Is the blockade so total that Horten's convoys cannot get through? April 21, 22. Convoy ONS-5 leaves Britain in an attempt to break through to America. There are 40 merchant ships in the convoy with escorts. Waiting for them are more than 30 U-boats. 6 days in, as the convoy approaches Torpedo Alley, the Germans again change the settings on their Enigma code. British codebreakers can no longer decipher the German Triton signals and warn convoy ONS-5 of the U-boat movements. It's the point of no return. First contact between the U-boat Wolfpacks and convoy ONS-5 is made on April 28th. The first ship sunk is an American freighter. Bad weather sets in, and the slow-moving convoy breaks up. The escorts are now running out of fuel. More ships are dispatched from Newfoundland. 42 U-boats are now in position to attack the convoy. 6 move in and sink 7 ships, but they are not unscathed. Allied aircraft from Canada detect 1 U-boat group. They sink 1 U-boat and damage 2 others. Though they do not know it, whoever triumphs in the next long, grim days and nights will change the course of World War II. At this crucial moment, British codebreakers crack the change in the German Enigma code settings. They monitor signals from U-boat headquarters, guiding more U-boats into the attack. In one 8-hour period, U-boats make 24 attacks. 1 is sunk. Then, fog closes in, and the U-boats are unable to press home their advantage. In the vital hours this gives, the new escorts from Canada reach the embattled convoy and take up position. They are then able to counterattack, sinking 2 more U-boats and damaging several more. Convoy ONS-5 gets through and limps into Halifax, Nova Scotia. 12 of its 40 merchantmen have been sunk, but at a massive cost. 7 U-boats are destroyed, with 2 more lost in collisions. 5 U-boats are crippled, and another 12 are damaged. Within weeks, the Allies have introduced a very long-range version of the Liberator bomber, which can cover the whole Atlantic. Increasing numbers of escort carriers are introduced to give further protection to the convoys. Torpedo Alley has been closed.
This was the crucial month of the Battle of the Atlantic, the month in which the Atlantic ceases to be a battlefield and becomes instead a highway through which these enormous amounts of American supplies, weapons, and ultimately troops can make their way from North America to Europe.
By the end of May 1943, U-boat losses rise from 13% of boats at sea to over 30%. In May alone, Dönitz loses 43 vessels and calls his wolf packs home to seek less lethal hunting grounds. During 1944, the Germans attempt to turn the tables again by developing new technology, such as the snorkel, which enables their U-boats to remain underwater for much longer periods, and thus avoid detection from the air. They also develop new U-boats, which are faster underwater than on the surface. But it's too late. Dönitz is never again able to challenge the Allied supremacy at sea.
With the routes secure from the United States to the British Isles, once again the Allies could bring across the Atlantic the vital resources that they needed to launch a second front, and that of course eventually ended in the battle on D-Day, 6th of June 1944.
In contrast, in the Pacific, the US blockade steadily cuts Japan off from the supplies she needs to survive, without the Japanese making any meaningful attempt to break the stranglehold. By 1945, Japan's merchant fleet has been decimated. The Japanese are reduced to shipping desperately needed supplies in smaller and smaller boats, and the US submarines are hunting them down. By the time the war in the East ends, the Japanese merchant marine has lost over 8 million tons of vessels. US submarines account for 4.9 million tons, or 60%. But it's not without cost. Of the 288 US submarines deployed in World War II, including the Atlantic, 52 are lost, with 48 destroyed in the Pacific war zones. American submariners, who comprise only 1.6% of the Navy, suffer one of the highest loss rates in the US Armed Forces, with 22% killed. In the Atlantic, German U-boats sink 2,603 merchant ships and 175 Allied warships, but lose 784 boats out of 1,162 built. And of the 40,900 men of the U-boat service, nearly 26,000 die, and another 5,000 are taken prisoner. But to keep the Atlantic convoys running, over 30,000 Allied seamen lose their lives. So how did the two submarine campaigns, the German in the Atlantic and the American in the Pacific, meet the essential requirements in the battle plan for blockade? Political will. In the Battle of the Atlantic, Hitler delayed unleashing his most potent weapon for almost 2 years because of concern about the US response. After Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt had no need to consider the question. Method. Both Germany and America were initially unclear as to the method to employ. Both were originally locked into the concept of the Great Fleet Action and the importance of battleships. Both, for different reasons, soon recognized the key role of the submarine in blockade. Technology. Both the Germans in the Atlantic and the Americans in the Pacific pushed the technology of submarine warfare as rapidly as they could. The problem the Germans faced, however, was that the Allies were even more effective at developing the technology of anti-submarine warfare. In both cases, but especially in the Atlantic, technology had a clear impact on the other requirements in the battle plan. Intelligence. The Germans, British, and Americans were acutely aware of the importance of intelligence. The key difference in the two campaigns was that in the Atlantic, it was the defenders, the Allies, who had most success in breaking their opponent's code. In the Pacific, American code breakers were able to penetrate Japanese signals, while the American code system remained secure. Tactics. Both the Germans and the Americans employed their submarines in packs. In the Atlantic, the Allies operated in convoys and worked hard to develop new anti-submarine tactics. In the Pacific, the Japanese showed no interest in anti-submarine measures and suffered accordingly. April 1945, a surrendered U-boat docks in London. In the end, the German battle plan failed because it didn't keep up in the technological race. The American battle plan not only succeeded, but played a major, though unsung role in the defeat of Japan. Since World War II, blockade has still been used, but usually called something else.
A blockade is an act of war. And since World War II, we haven't used the term blockade to describe attempts to cut hostile nations off from their support. We have, however, used the technique quite often. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the U.S. Navy enforces a quarantine of Cuba. During the Falkland Islands War, the Royal Navy enforces the total exclusion zone around the Falkland Islands. And during our long Cold War with Saddam Hussein, we used both air and naval power to enforce sanctions.
Blockade can also be imposed on land and broken from the air. In 1948, the Soviet Union tried to cut off the Allied sector of Berlin. The West responded with the Berlin airlift. At one point, aircraft were flying in supplies at the rate of 1 every minute. After a year, the blockade was lifted. But what of the battle plan for blockade in the future?
There is no doubt that in the future, if two sides come together and are of equal force, there is the potential for attritional warfare. In attritional warfare, blockade has an incredibly important role to play in strangling a nation and ensuring eventual military victory.
So even with the sophistication of the 21st century, it seems the battle plan for blockade, or a modern version of it, continues.